For Session Update, I'm Shannon Lurkey. 4 state senators, 2 Republicans, and 2 Democrats joined forces in support of 2 bills aimed at reducing gun violence. Here's that press conference.
Well, good morning, everyone. I want to thank you all for coming today, and I especially want to thank my fellow senators, Senator Scott Jensen, Senator Paul Anderson, and Senator Susan Kent, for joining me on these bipartisan bills to reduce gun violence. I'll start with some introductory remarks about the bills we're presenting. Each senator will give their own remarks, and then we'll take some questions. The Parkland tragedy has changed our country. The senseless slaughter of 17 innocent people in yet another mass school shooting has galvanized student leadership across our nation and right here in Minnesota. What we adults failed to do for 30 years, our kids are now doing. That shames me. It should shame us all. More importantly, it should wake us up, shake us, until we realize that doing nothing cannot save us from the next shooting or the one after that. Our young students aren't willing to accept the same tired old excuses for doing nothing, and neither should we. Thankfully, these kids have created a moment that demands action, and a moment where real action is finally possible. Shortly after Parkland, I began reaching out to Republicans, NRA members, and other gun owners to find out where we had common ground to reduce gun violence. I was overwhelmed by the response. In conversation after conversation, we found many solutions we agreed upon. Inspired by these talks, I reached out to my Senate colleagues here today. After a number of hard discussions and revisions, we've agreed on 2 bills: universal background checks and mandatory reporting for lost or stolen firearms. We believe these bills, when taken together, will help to keep guns out of the hands of criminals. The first bill on universal background checks will require that all transfers of a firearm have an FFL present and a background check done. There are a number of exemptions for family, antiques, hunting, and a number of other situations. One of the concerns that has been listed before in universal background checks is the availability of an FFL so that people can get a background check and purchase a firearm. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms of Minnesota says that Minnesota has over 1,400 FFLs, and 98.9% of Minnesotans live within 10 miles of a licensed dealer. The second bill is mandatory reporting of a lost or stolen firearm. The requirements under this bill will be that if an individual finds out or discovers that their firearm is missing, within 14 days they have to report that to the local police. We believe this will cut down on straw person purchasers circumventing the law. Currently, straw purchasers pretend to buy a gun for themselves while actually intending to sell the weapons at a premium price to people who cannot legally buy a firearm. So essentially, they're able to claim that the gun is later lost and avoid any sort of prosecution. This bill will help put an end to that. Straw buyers will have a very difficult time avoiding penalty if they later claim that a gun is lost or stolen. I do want to emphasize that this is only the start of the discussion. I think there are many possibilities for more agreement and changes, such as expanding the family exclusions under our own background check bill, authorizing funds for anti-straw person sales training to dealers, enforcing conditions of release on those charged with domestic violence, mental health resources, and voluntary ineligibility to possess a firearm. Now, I know some people will raise the same old, tired objections. Some people will say that this won't stop the next school shooting, but they simply cannot know that, and it just might. People will say this won't solve all gun crimes, and that's true. Of course, no single solution will end all gun violence. That's a ridiculous and cynical standard used by some to prevent change. But these bills will make us safer and make it more difficult for criminals and dangerous people to obtain guns. Every step saves lives. People will say the government is trying to take away everyone's guns. But I want to be absolutely clear. Everyone standing here supports the Second Amendment rights of legal gun owners to possess guns for hunting, protection, and sport shooting. Anyone that says otherwise is trying to scare you into the old gridlock that has cost so many innocent lives. In fact, these bills protect gun owners from liability if they unknowingly sell a gun to a convicted criminal or violent offender. And these bills protect the reputations of the 99.9% of gun owners in Minnesota who are honest, law-abiding citizens. To be here today, each of us have had to put aside our party line talking points. We had to build trust with each other, and we've worked through difficult discussions to find common ground. You're going to hear that these bills don't go far enough, and you're going to hear that they go way too far. But that should tell you how important this agreement is as a first step. Saving students' lives is more important than anyone's partisan agenda. Unfortunately, without meaningful bipartisan solutions, another school shooting is virtually inevitable. Partisan gridlock is literally costing our students' lives, and only breaking beyond party dogma can save them. But with more bipartisan agreements like this one, we can reduce the amount of gun violence in Minnesota and restore young people's faith in the future. Thank you. Now I'll turn it over to my colleagues, beginning with Senator Jensen.
Good morning, and thank you for coming. Oftentimes, we think of a piece of legislation as a destination instead of a journey. I think what we're doing this morning is a first step, and we're asking our colleagues to step alongside of us, and I think they will. They'll help us give what we're putting before you this morning more shape, a better shape, and I'm confident that our colleagues will do so. Already, both of our caucuses have tried to lead in the area of school safety. I think we've all heard the thunder of the noise of Americans clamoring for action. Not again do we want one more tragedy to sort of evaporate into the horizon and we do nothing. We hear the thunder. But I think the four of us stand before you today because we also hear the deafening silence of a lack of conversation in the halls of capitals around the nation. So we have to further the discussion. Safe schools, critically important, but the discussion can't stop there. Before my brother committed suicide, he had gotten access to a gun, and it scared my entire family because Bruce had been involuntarily committed to a psychiatric hospital. When we were able to remove the gun from Bruce, we were able to get another couple of years of his presence with us. But when he jumped from an 18th-story building, there was no getting any more time. The last patient I saw this morning before I left my office is perhaps one of the most active FFL gun dealers in our area for the last 50 years. And as he gave me a campaign check and said, "Doc, keep doing what you're doing," I said, "Do you know that this morning I'm going to come out for universal gun checks?" He said, "You go for it, Doc." So to me, when I say that I can support this piece of legislation regarding universal background checks, I say my stars. We do this for our Sunday school teachers. I do this before I hire someone that's going to draw your blood in my office. What does a background check really look for? It looks for 6 things specifically, other than some demographic information, and they don't even insist on your social security number. We look for criminal convictions that would call for a sentence of longer than 1 year in prison. We look for juvenile delinquent convictions. We look for mental health records in regards to involuntary commitments. We look for protection orders, such as stalking. We look for warrants outstanding for your arrest. And we look for drug addictions that have hit the legal system. We also do some things like checking citizenship. And if you renounce your citizenship in the U.S., you're not going to get an instant quick pass-through. But the fact of the matter is more than 90% of universal background checks go through quickly and expeditiously. In regards to the straw man legislation, really? We're going to balk about that? You want to buy a gun and give it to someone else that maybe couldn't get it on their own? What kind of nutcase are you? That's got to stop. This isn't a time to posture and, be political. That's just wrong. I wouldn't do that. buying someone a 12-pack of beer, being 21, and going and giving it to a 15-year-old and telling them to pay me a $5 premium. We got to stop that. So I'm real comfortable with this. But the reason I'm comfortable is because I think we've already seen leadership lead on this issue. And I think what we're trying to do is we're trying to expand the lines. We're trying to say, the dialogue's out there, we got to have it. So I want to say thank you to each of these senators standing with me today, and especially Senator Little for his courage. And I would want to say thank you to Senator Paul Anderson, because he has counseled me over the weekend with some words that might have been wiser than I otherwise might have shared. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I think what you will find in these two bills is a very bipartisan and pragmatic, common sense approach to addressing this issue that has gripped our nation, has gripped our communities. And over the last few weeks, I've spoken to hundreds of people on this issue, hundreds of students that you've seen that are asking for a change. And something hit me when I was at a high school a couple of weeks ago. And I looked out and I started thinking, not only as man am I old, is these students were all born about 2000 that were seniors in high school. They are a post 9/11 if you think about it. They grew up in a new generation, a new normal. And we are not living in the Mayberry days or the leave it to Beaver days of everything is fine. And I think sometimes as adults we try and wrestle with what was. And we live in a different world today. And so when I take a look at these two bills, and you look at the background checks, and as Senator Jensen talked about, if you want to be a Sunday school teacher or work in the nursery at our church, we have to go through a background check. I've been a youth sports coach. I've had to go through a background check. We request all these things, and when it comes down to it, there's very, very few people that will say, when you say you're talking about trying to prevent folks that have a criminal history or have mental health issues that can pose harm to themselves or others, that we need to make sure that they don't have access to guns. And I don't think that's not a common sense pragmatic approach to addressing this. And again, as Senator Jensen said about the straw man purchasing, that's again. But when it all comes down to it, this is about a conversation. These bills may not be in primetime form, but our hope is to create a further conversation. We're working together to hopefully have that, because what it can't be is, and I understand this is a very passionate, heartfelt positions on both sides of this issue, but it can't be get rid of all guns. It's just not going to happen, and it can't be arm everybody with no limitations. And so when it comes down to it, to say if you're going to own a gun, you have to go through a background check that makes sure you're not a criminal and that you don't have mental health issues that potentially causes harms to yourself or others. I think that's a way that we can move forward together and create a further discussion. I will acknowledge, and I want to make sure to acknowledge the great work that's been done in our caucus and in the Democrat Senate caucus around safe schools. I think we're going to really have some consensus around that. There's been some strong work from Senators Pratt and Senator Nelson, and then around mental health. Senator Senjum has been a champion on this, and others in our caucus. And I think it does come down to a conversation on those three areas. Not one is going to solve this, as Senator Little mentioned. You know, I don't know if this can prevent future attacks, but at the same time, we have to do something, and I think we have to look at it as a holistic approach. So, appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts.
Good morning, and thank you for being here. I'm Susan Kent, State Senator for representing Woodbury, Landfall, and parts of Maplewood and Oakdale. I'm the Assistant DFL Leader in the Senate, and I'm the ranking member on the Education Policy Committee, where we are focusing closely on keeping our schools and our students safe. And in fact, tomorrow we will be having a hearing on a number of those bills. In listening to Senator Anderson talk about our high school students now, I'm the mother of a high school junior, so I relate to this pretty closely. Not only are they post 9/11, they're post Columbine, and for many of us, perhaps not Senator Little, we grew up in a different era when it was different to go to schools, and Columbine really changed everything. And many of us remember major events in our history, like 9/11, obviously, and where we were at that time. As a mom, I remember where I was when I heard about Sandy Hook, and I will never forget that moment. So in that spirit, and with the spirit of the students around our country, and particularly from Parkland, and after that happened, I had to put my arm around my son once again and have another conversation. I want to thank Senator Little for his leadership in bringing these bills forward and in bringing this coalition of bipartisan members together. And I want to thank our co-authors, Senator Anderson and Senator Jensen, for joining this bipartisan effort. We know that to keep our communities safe from gun violence will require broad bipartisan support for reasons of politics. We also know that beyond politics, it is just the right thing to do. We can work together to find solutions that will make a difference, that we can all agree on, and I am pleased that that's what we're bringing forward today. Often in life, it is the simplest ideas that are the most effective. Criminal background checks to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people is one of these ideas. I am glad to join my colleagues in advancing these bills to keep Minnesotans safe. The National Instant Criminal Background Check System, also known as NICS, was launched in 1998. Since then, NICS has identified more than 1.3 million applications from felons, the seriously mentally ill, drug abusers, and other dangerous people who are prohibited by federal law from possessing firearms. Making sure that criminal background checks are applied to all firearm purchases just makes sense. The nonpartisan RAND Corporation recently completed a 2-year review of gun safety laws around the country and confirmed that background checks do result in reductions of violent crime and suicide. These policies are also broadly supported by Americans. A Quinnipiac poll released in February shows that 90% of all Americans and 97% of gun owners support criminal background checks to keep our communities and our schools safe. Thank you for being here, and we are now ready to take questions.
Do you have these bills scheduled in committee?
We do not have them scheduled in committee yet. They were dropped in the hopper today and should be introduced on Wednesday, and we'll request a hearing right away.
Have you talked to the appropriate people yet?
I'm sure we could disagree about appropriate people, but, you know.
Who makes the decision?
Yeah, I understand. You know, our focus today was to announce our agreement, and we'll be having those discussions over the next couple days.
Are any of you prepared to lose your seats over this bill?
I am always prepared to lose my seat.
Others, all of you, you know this is a risk in your districts, right?
You know, I can only speak for myself, and these are issues. I think each candidate has their different reasons for running. And for me, my identity, although it's a great honor to represent the people of Senate District 44 in Plymouth and Minnetonka and Woodland, my identity is not in this job. I did this to represent my community and the constituents I serve. And like Senator Kent, I've got 2 daughters, and looking at them and this issue, this is, again, we live in a new normal. We live in a new world, and we have to have the ability to have these conversations. I didn't run and had many conversations with many people to come down here and be a part of gridlock. It's not what I think any of us ran for. And so if it means losing my seat, it means losing my seat.
Senator Scott Jensen, Carver County. In Carver County, we take a little bit of a rock'em sock'em approach to a lot of issues. There's not a whole lot of call for groupthink and lockstep, so I'm prepared to have the discussion with my colleagues, whether they be Republicans or Democrats. I'm confident that we'll have a robust discussion, and it's not going to be just 1 or 2 phone calls based on what the phone's been doing this morning. I don't think I'm going to lose my seat over this issue, but if I do, que sera. But I think this is absolutely the right thing to do, and I think we sometimes get things mixed up when we get hired or when we get elected. I look at that being hired by my constituents. I work for them. I don't work for any group down here. I actually don't work for the caucus. I work for my constituents, and I have to incorporate at every level of my conscience when I make a decision. The caucus for me is a resource, and I want to be a contributing resource to others in the caucus. But I feel very at peace with the decision I made in this regard. I hope that I haven't unduly taken my colleagues in the Republican caucus by surprise with this. What we said as a caucus was that we were going to focus on school safety, and I agree with that completely. But I think where Senator Anderson and I are comfortable moving forward is that we feel absolutely an obligation to widen the lines of this conversation, and that's why we're doing this. Thank you.
Can I follow up on that? How much of this is conscious and how much of it is it constituents for you? Does this fall on one or the other? Is it both?
Well, that's a good question. The constituents that I've spoken with, and over the weekend I've spoken with sheriffs and policemen and deputies and FFL people. Now, if you look at Carver County, that's a pretty conservative area. I think I got quite a few votes in the last election, if I remember. And there's going to be a fair amount of people that are disappointed with me, so I definitely need to explain the universal background checks and the straw man. And I also need to explain to them the bills I wasn't comfortable with doing. I wasn't entirely comfortable with Florida Governor Rick Scott's actions on Friday, the bill he signed. But I think what it reflects is the discussion is expanding. And I have to believe that the constituents in Carver County are broad-minded enough that they'll say, okay, Doc, let's engage the discussion, and we will.
Are you saying that your conscience, though, is the driver? Is that the leading force?
It has to be on this issue, because in Carver County, as a general rule, I think you'd find a lot of NRA members and things like that, people like that. And I am a member of the NRA, and I have a permit to carry. I don't dare trust myself. I think I'd probably shoot my foot off. But I do have the ability to do it because I wanted to learn what you have to go through in order to have a permit to carry. And I very much respect the Minnesota laws, and I object to the constitutional carry because I don't want other states doing an end around. We've got good, strong standards if you're going to get a permit to carry. I want to see those preserved.
Senator
Kent,
Little,
yeah.
how much of this was a response?
She hasn't had a
Excuse
chance
me,
to
Can I
respond.
please respond to Mary's question? I do want to weigh in on
you.
this one.
Yeah.
When I was elected almost 6 years ago, I walked around knocking on doors, and I told people I was a little too old for a career in politics. I was running for a seat that had swung repeatedly. And so I've never had any pretense about longevity here. You know, I'm just here to do the job that I feel like I was sent here to do, and that's been my priority. And, you know, as Senator Jensen, I think you raised a really good question, it is the right thing to do. And I know in other tough issues, sometimes we have to lead and talk to our communities and have that conversation and see if we can get to a place where everybody understands what it is we're trying to do. Not always the most popular thing, but sometimes people do appreciate that we're standing up for what we believe in and what we think is in our communities and our state's best interest. I'll also say that a little over a week ago, my House counterpart, Representative Joanne Ward, and I had a listening session in Woodbury, and we were the notice got out in the various groups that support or oppose different types of gun regulations. And so we were a little prepared for a big debate. But as we went around the room, and there were people representing both sides in the room, and then we started talking about it, there really was a very thoughtful, solid conversation, a lot of listening, and everybody in that room agrees that we need to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them, and that background checks is the best solution. They go to Dick's, they go to Cabela's, they fill out that forms, they go through that process, and they understand that there are ways for people who know that they wouldn't pass that process to get around it, and they don't think that's okay. So I think that's just the conversation we need to keep having, and if that's the case, you know, we'll let the chips fall where they may.
And just quickly, another addition to that too. I think, again, to reiterate, this is an area that I think if you look at a lot of comments, if you listen to a lot of our constituents, even the strong NRA members would agree. You look at polling on this. If you look at just overall opinion polling, people expect there to be some kind of threshold or ability for us to make sure the people that are law-abiding citizens, this protects their Second Amendment right. But at the same time, if people are criminals or have mental health issues that potentially cause harm to themselves or others, they need to go through a background check. I want to share Chris Cox, who leads much of the discussion on behalf of the NRA when it comes to gun issues. He said this: "If we want to prevent future atrocities, we must look for solutions that keep guns out of the hands of those who are a danger to themselves or others, while protecting the right of law-abiding Americans." So this is, again, this is kind of bringing together a conversation that's happening in our country. And I do believe that we were all elected and sent here, and we all have our beliefs and our principles, but in the end, we were sent here to carry on the conversations of our constituents, and that's what we're trying to do here.
Are you a gun owner and a member of the NRA?
I'm not, but interesting, similar to Senator Jensen, so I am an NRA member. I did have my permit to carry, and unfortunately I let my permit lapse. I don't have a gun, but in 2003 when this was passed, I went through the training because I wanted to understand what the whole process was like, and it's really good training. And so, again, for me, that was a great process to go through, and I do intend on going through the class again when I have some free time, probably not till June.
You said that these bills might not be as you want to see them. What are you looking for as a final outcome?
Well, what I'm looking for right now is the ability to have a conversation. I think there's going to be, there's going to be strong opposition from both sides. Some people want to see far more things done. Some people may not want to see anything done. But this is truly an opportunity for us to come together. This is how bills get done here at the Capitol. We come together and we sit down and have the conversation.
I think there's probably three places that we need to continue the conversation on the universal background checks. The first is the scope of the family exclusion, making sure you can transfer it to a family member, and possibly expanding that. I think the second thing we need to talk about is the cost of using an FFL. That's been a concern that's brought up, and making sure that it's a reasonable price that people can afford. And then also, if there's any areas in the state of Minnesota where there really doesn't exist an FFL, that's another area where we could work. Just trying to address all the concerns that have been traditionally brought up regarding background checks.
Senator Little, how much of this is a response to the teenagers we've seen coming forward?
They've been inspiring, and there's no other way I can describe that. Just to see a high school freshman emailing you, calling you, and wanting a meeting and asking how they can help. I've been elected 8 years, and I really haven't seen that kind of involvement from our high school students. So it has been absolutely inspiring, and it is definitely the majority of this pushes because of that.
Senator, just one quick. Thank you, Senator Scott Jensen. Just to follow up on that conversation previously regarding the shape of these bills, all four of us up here realize that we have colleagues that have spent a lot of time thinking about this and have been involved. Senator Bach, Senator Gazelka, Senator Limmer. These are people we need to reach out to and say, how can you help us make this bill better? So I think there's no question we're committed to that process. That's why I think Senator Anderson made the comment regarding whether or not these bills are specifically ready for prime time. That's not the most important thing about this morning. The important thing about this morning is that this piece of legislation is going to have a journey, and this is a first step, and we're expecting our colleagues to come alongside us and help us. Thank you.
Senator Jensen, one of the gun groups is already saying that you've betrayed them and you lied on the form that you filled out during your campaign that you said you would oppose these types of background checks. Want to respond?
That's a great question, and I appreciate the opportunity. I think being in the Senate is an incredible experience, and the intensity with which issues come at you, absolutely I may have changed what I wrote on a form 2 years ago before I'd never had a public debate. How many shootings have taken place since then? Am I a person that will try to take in the data and feel the rhythm of life around me and let that influence how I view the world? For sure. I don't think I've betrayed anybody. I think we've set the stage for a good, robust discussion. And as a previous questioner had asked, my conscience is my guide.
Why don't you come back up, doctor? Do you view this issue different as a doctor? Are you a member of the Minnesota Medical Association? Do you agree with the MMA's stance on this?
The MMA represents approximately 30% of physicians in Minnesota, and I no longer have an MMA membership. Having said that, I think the MMA speaks oftentimes with profoundness on some issues and not so much on other issues, and that's probably why I don't have a membership. As a family doc, I've taken care of the 15-year-old kid who shot himself in the leg accidentally because he didn't realize his dad's handgun had a shell in it. I've taken care of the bullet deflection from the clavicle all the way down to the lower pelvis as I explored that body trying to find out where the damn bullet went. So yeah, I deal with this all the time. And then I shared with you previously some personal stories as well. I think sometimes my colleagues forget that. My heart is that of the heart of a family doctor. And so when I see, well, here's another one. I think I had a 15-year-old patient who killed his mother. He lay in wait and shot her with a 12 gauge. That was in the 1980s. He was a patient of mine. He was recently in the news again. Yeah, I live and breathe this stuff every day.
And that makes you different than somebody who isn't a doctor, doesn't deal with that?
It affords me a different perspective in my eyes. I would say that's perhaps a little broader perspective at times.
Senator Little, your caucus hasn't necessarily been of one voice on this issue in the past. What are you doing to kind of bring along some of those rural members who have voiced concern in the past about going too far in the gun control direction?
Yeah, I think it's a similar answer to earlier. This is the start. We're going to continue to have conversations with everybody. Things don't pass here right now without bipartisan support. And so that's absolutely what we need to do, is talk to our own caucus and talk to the opposite caucus as well. That's the only way it's going to get done.
Senator Little, can we talk about your district again and how difficult this vote might be? I know you heard from students, but their parents have typically voted Republican in your district. You're the first Democrat to.
Well, as you know, the first time I got elected was when I was 25 in the city of Lakeville as their city councilor. I made a commitment to myself that every single night I go to sleep, I wouldn't be thinking about a vote or question the work I was doing. I have no qualms about the work I'm conducting here and on universal background checks or mandatory reporting. So that, I guess, to me, that's not the most important question I have to ask myself. But in answering that, I'm not worried. I'm not worried. I think my district supports this. The people I've heard from my district support that. As I mentioned in my comments, I've been having conversation after conversation with Republican gun owners, many of them NRA members, and there is not widespread opposition to universal background checks.
Have any of you talked to the leaders or other leaders in your caucus to see if they're supportive, opposed, have any ideas? And for the Republicans, do you expect a hearing on these?
I'll just say that in the DFL Senate caucus, we have had conversations about this issue. There are a number of conversations. It's complex. I mean, setting politics aside, I mean, the issues, whether you're talking about things that we would do with regard to guns versus things that we would do with regard to schools, and then even the question of, you know, do we have enough research to make the best informed decisions? And the bill that Senator Klein has introduced, for example, you know, those are the kinds of conversations that we are talking about. And it is a process, as we know. You know, a legislative session is definitely its own journey, and we are in the middle of that. And you know, I think we're trying to listen to each other and work together to see, because we do know it is important that whatever we do is going to have some amount of bipartisan support. And that's what we hear from our constituents. They want us to be working together. And I think this is I can't imagine a better example right now to be able to do that.
Have you talked to your leaders?
You asked a question, sir, about conversations with members of our caucus. It would be safe to say that we've had multiple contacts, and it would also be safe to say that we haven't received the blessings of everyone. But through this process, we've received many blessings.
Senator Henderson, you touched on this, but I don't know if it might bear repeating or expounding. The idea that if you can't solve every act of gun violence, there's no point trying to regulate further.
Say that again, John?
Just the idea that no particular regulation is going to stop every potential attack. So why even?
I think
Senator Little actually made that comment.
Yeah, well, I would just respond to that in the sense that we have to do something. I think doing nothing is not an option. And again, this is coming to the situation of having the conversation. And again, our constituents, the people who voted for us, expect us here to have healthy debates. And is there anything bigger, if not one of the biggest issues right now is this issue. So to make progress, again, on those areas that we've already done some good work with regards to safe schools, and hopefully we can have some bipartisan work at the end of the session to show and help our school districts become safer schools. And the mental health, hopefully we can make some progress on that. But within that, the conversation in this area is really important. Public safety, and I think Senator Jensen said, I've had conversations with law enforcement, I've had conversations with parents, I've had conversations with veterans, and again, the vast majority say we need to do something, and we're here trying to do something.
If I could just comment on that question as well. There was an interesting article in the Star-Trib a few days ago where a gentleman in his 40s talked about when he was in his teens, he had a desire to go on a mass spree killing. But because of some things that had happened and the fact that he couldn't get access to a gun, that deterred him. And an act of friendship brought him through some tough times. Forgive me for going medical on you, but when we get colonoscopies done, we're always removing polyps, and oftentimes those are precancerous polyps. We will never know how many people we spared from dying a death of colon cancer when we remove those polyps. That's sort of like what we're doing here. If a bill like a universal background check can stop some things, we may never see it register on the radar screen, but that doesn't mean it isn't having an effect. If we're going to try to use that kind of teleologic reasoning, we may as well go sine die today and go home.
Just real quickly, do you have a House author or authors for these bills?
We do not yet.
Are you looking for somebody?
Of course. So we'll probably do one more and then wrap it up. Okay, thank you. My staff person, Robert, will be at the door. He has copies of the bills if you want them, and I know also a release was done at 10 a.m. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you.